Our final speaker of the evening is Robert Steiner, and I had an interesting first introduction with Robert. In fact, I didn't want to meet him. So my daughter and his daughter were in a play, and the two daughters said after the play, we want to get ice cream or dinner or something like that. And it turns out that his daughter and my daughter both wanted to have dinner together. And now I'm a fairly social individual. I do like meeting people, trust me. I'm happy to meet all of you. But for whatever reason that night, I was like, I don't want to go and have dinner with these people. I've never met them. So I was like, but ding, hey, great to meet you. We're going to have dinner together. So we sat down, this was a couple of years ago, and we sat down and had dinner. Within 5 minutes, we'd made some amazing connections that I won't go into here. But more importantly, I sat down and talked to Robert. And I was like, oh my God, this guy's awesome. What did you say you wrote speeches for the Prime Minister? Oh, okay. What? You're in the communications business. I was enthralled. So that led to me asking him if maybe I had a little bit of a man crush on him. I don't know. But I did ask if we could go grab a coffee, and one thing led to another, and that, of course, led me to asking him to be our final speaker here tonight. Now, a little bit about Robert before I bring him up on stage. Having led the launch of the Monk School Fellowships in Global Journalism at the University of Toronto, Robert brings his experience as a former Wall Street Journal foreign correspondent and lead speechwriter for the Honorable Paul Martin and the Honorable Jean Chrétien. This unique perspective allows him to go deep and ask probing and compelling questions and examine the future of society through the lens of political leadership. Now, through this critical view, Robert is able to adeptly assess the impact both truth and lies have on our society. I hope you enjoy, as much as I did chatting with him that first night, Robert's take on truth. Oh.
Geez, I think maybe I should just leave right now. I think that was probably the best part. And I apologize for sitting down. I hope it's okay. It turns out that part of my truth does not involve running a 10K race last weekend, which left me with really wicked plantar's fasciitis. So I'll sit for a little bit. I'll stand for a little bit. But I hope, can people sort of at least see me back there more or less? I feel like we've been dancing delicately towards the, well, maybe that might encourage folks to sort of come into the middle a little bit too. Awesome, that would be great. I feel like we've been dancing delicately towards the elephant in the room. Randy gave us a sense of some of the urgency on this planet, which starts to touch on the elephant in the room. Lisa mentioned the elephant's name, Donald Trump. And so I will just introduce the elephant and the elephant tamer, if you will, Hillary Clinton, right into the middle of this room and open a conversation about truth and that. And I actually want to start by introducing a couple of voters and how they're thinking about their vote a few months before the election. And I'll read you two things, if you'll just let me open this up. The first actually was in Maclean's magazine a little while ago. She is a 38-year-old teacher. She lives in Connecticut. And this is what she had to say about her vote. I'm a woman. I'm a strong woman at that. I have an intense aversion to obnoxious and arrogant men. I want to change from the lies that are commonplace. I can appreciate honesty even when I don't particularly love the way in which the honest ideas are delivered. And here's another. This one is from an 80-year-old white man in California who wrote this in the LA Times. Did you read that editorial, he writes, a full page, saying essentially that our country is not what it was. The article goes on to detail just who we've become, and it is not pretty. It's very sad, and this government denies its citizens the right to vote because they're afraid that we'll vote to return a government that will once again represent the values that the rest of the world looked up to us for. So that first one, the 38-year-old woman from Connecticut, was explaining the way that Donald Trump had tapped into her emotions to become a supporter of Donald Trump. The second, the 80-year-old white man living in California, is Donald Sutherland, Canadian, liberal Canadian, who was explaining how Justin Trudeau had tapped into his emotions to want to support Justin Trudeau. And here's the thing. Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau are tapping into the same moment in history. They're both emotionally driven politicians, and emotion is returning to politics. And I'd argue that if you care about truth, that's actually a really good thing, for two reasons. One is that truth, and I think we've already gotten a hint of this today from the other two speakers, truth is not just facts. Truth is a lot more than facts. Truth is conflicting facts, fighting back and forth inside an envelope of conflicting emotions, good emotions, bad emotions. Trump may be lying on the facts. Trudeau may be lying on the facts. But they're both tapping into something very, very true, very honest when they tap into anger, fear, pride, compassion. That's very true. The other reason why I think it's good that emotions coming back into politics is that politics ultimately is about relationships. These elections we have every 4 or 5 years, depending on your system, these are actually ways that we re-gauge our social relationships across a whole country, a whole society. And relationships are way too complicated to just be about facts. So in politics, when I was in politics and when I covered it as a journalist, in politics we talk about evidence-based health policy, evidence-based tax policy, evidence-based foreign policy. When you watch the debates, that's really what the debates are about. The debates are about probing to see how much evidence lies behind what these politicians are actually saying. But if you can imagine for a moment an evidence-based marriage, like if you're lucky, 2 days a week, the evidence works out in your favor. I would say, in my case, I feel very lucky that my marriage is based on more than just evidence, because after Monday afternoon, usually I've run out of the evidence that would keep Amanda in the marriage with me, and after that it's just all about emotion. So we accept, that emotion plays an important role in intimate relationships. And emotion also needs to play an important role, does play an important role in our public relationships. But it's scary to think about the idea that fear and pride have legitimate places in politics and in public life. It's scary. Because we've sort of developed a system over the last 200-300 years, the development of our modern world, in the West anyway, where we've swung back and forth between emotion and fact and evidence. We accept that they're both legitimate, but we don't really accept that they're both legitimate about the same thing at the same time. Some things are about emotion, some things are about fact. If you just think about the history, the last 300 years of Western society, right? To go back to the 18th century, this was a huge fact bucket. Anything that was about facts was awesome. And so we got the scientific revolution, we got stock markets, we got the Declaration of Independence in the United States, all these factor things. We got great political theory, Adam Smith and Rousseau and Voltaire. But if you look at the stuff that was supposed to be about emotion, like music, once you get beyond Mozart and maybe Handel on a good day, it's sort of, painting, I can't think of a really great painter from the 19th century, the 18th century in the West. In literature, what's the great novel that was in the 18th century? Robinson Crusoe, which is a good Disney movie, but doesn't sort of hold a candle to the stuff that comes in the next century. Next century, we swing right back off of facts into emotions. And all this stuff is supposed to be emotionally driven. It's awesome. We have Beethoven, and Brahms, and Tchaikovsky. This is awesome stuff. In art, we have the Impressionists. In literature, we go from Robinson Crusoe, which is a good book, to the Bronte sisters and Dostoevsky. It is an emotional bucket filled with this great stuff. But the stuff is supposed to be fact-based, like politics, policy, political theory. We get Marx, right? Marx, who actually is responsible probably for killing tens of millions of people if you sort of add it all up over the course of the ensuing 100 years. And we got in the habit, we sort of mastered the art of the partly true, because we really got in the habit of putting things in buckets. Some ideas are conservative, others are liberal. Some people are rich, others are poor. Some people are men, others are women. Some ideas are emotional. Some issues require evidence. And we create these huge problems for ourselves because these buckets are only ever partly true. And I think that when we left that 19th century, that big emotional bucket, and took all of those awesome emotions and romance and marched right into the First World War, those of us, or maybe our ancestors, who survived and came out of the other end of that must have decided that the 20th century was not going to be about emotions anymore. The stakes were way too high. In public life, 20th century was going to be about facts. And by and large, at least in the democratic world, that worked out pretty well, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to mobilize a whole country out of the Depression, at least we like to think he did. Mobilize a whole country out of the Depression by basically telling people, get over your feelings. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Forget that emotion. Just get back to work. It's such a powerful statement. It's inscribed on his monument in Washington, and we love it. But the problem is that once we decided to squeeze emotion out of politics, politics actually became less honest. So I worked for the better part of 2003 as Paul Martin's speechwriter. I actually had not worked as Jean Chrétien's speechwriter. I was in charge of the online web campaign for Chrétien 2000. But I was, for some mysterious reason, tapped to be Paul Martin's speechwriter when he was running for the leadership of the Liberal Party. And I'd actually never written a speech before other than my wedding speech. But I watched a lot of West Wing. And I knew the Sam Seaborn character, the guy played by Rob Lowe, really, really well. Like, he was my favorite character even before I became a speechwriter. And I figured, if I just sort of act like Sam Seaborn, one way or another, this'll all work out. And it turned out that my boss was acting like Toby Ziegler, and the other boss was acting like Josh Lyman. And on a good day, Paul Martin was acting like President, Josiah Bartlett. So it all sort of worked. And here we are, we're flying across the country, pretending to be West Wing. And I thought at one point, West Wing's a pretty emotional program. Like, there's a lot of emotion in that show. That's why I like it. So maybe I should get some more emotion into Paul's speeches, not so that he becomes emotional, because at the time as I was learning about politics, I realized politics is not a place for emotion. Politics is a place to use emotion, but being emotional is too flaky, and Paul wasn't going to be emotional anyway. But maybe I could help him make a more poignant argument for infrastructure spending. Right? So I wanted to see how he tapped into his emotions when he was off script. And I followed him for a weekend up the coast of Labrador. No cameras, no journalists. He was just visiting a bunch of indigenous communities up the coast of Labrador. And I wanted to see him off the cuff. And what I witnessed was actually some of the most amazing political honesty that I'd ever seen. There's a place called Charlottetown, Labrador, where we flew in and we walked into a gym. About 50 indigenous kids there with their parents. Paul spent a fair bit of time, just a little larger than this room, but about the same kind of crowd, same kind of feeling. Paul spent a fair bit of time just speaking to the kids before he went up to the mic. So he got a sense of the room and what these kids were thinking. When he got up to the mic, without any notes, and I'm taking notes in the back of the room just to hear his turns of phrase, this is what he says. He says something along the lines of, I know you guys get your cable from Detroit, and you must watch these shows, and you must think that all these people in Detroit and Toronto, Montreal, are so cool, all these kids, because they get to do all the cool stuff. Well, let me tell you, I know these kids in Toronto, Montreal. Not one of them has ever gone caribou hunting with his dad. Not one of them has ever gone narwhal fishing with his grandpa in the winter. Not one. And in fact, a lot of these kids don't even see their moms and dads much during the week. So when I go back down and I tell them that I met a bunch of kids, including you and you and you, who just came back from caribou hunting with your dad, they're going to be blown away. That was it. He had a ton of facts he could have pulled out, but he didn't. And as we left and we sort of mingled at the end of that session, I was chatting with some of the parents, and they were overwhelmed. They said, what he did just now, he empowered these kids of ours who keep feeling left out, like the century's passing them by, like they don't get the cool stuff. And he didn't do that with facts. He hit that truth with emotion. Now, the fact is that the stakes were sort of low for Paul. He actually became prime minister. I think he was prime minister for a couple of years. The stakes were low for him, the stakes were high for him and for the kids in the room, but really not for anyone else that day. And it is harder for a politician to mix truth, to mix facts and emotion into truth when the stakes are really high. But some do, and the ones that can pull it off actually are really healing. And the story that I come to around this actually is April 4th, 1968. So Robert Kennedy is running for the Democratic nomination for president. We all think that he would have been president. In actual fact, he was losing very badly to to Hubert Humphrey at the time, about 120 delegates behind. He probably would not have won the nomination that year. But he's flying into Indianapolis to give a speech in what Donald Trump would call the inner city. And as his plane is landing in Indianapolis, Martin Luther King is bleeding out, dying on a balcony in Memphis. The mayor of Indianapolis gets on the plane and says, Senator, I really encourage you not to go into the inner city tonight. We can't guarantee your safety. The police have set up cordons all around the African-American communities in Indianapolis. And Robert Kennedy says, of course I'm going. A lot of people actually thought he had a death wish at that point. And so he drives in, past all the cops. His speechwriters in the back, Adam Walensky and Frank Mankiewicz, are jotting down notes madly. Suddenly, the senator's giving a speech totally different than what we thought. We're trying to move some of the arguments that he was making to make it relevant to this terrible night, this terrible event that's just happened. And as he walks up onto the flatbed truck where the mic is, this huge crowd, who hasn't yet heard, actually, that Martin Luther King is dead. Kennedy's the one who tells them. As he walks up, they hand him up, the pages that they just ripped out of their notebooks. And as a former speechwriter, I can imagine they must have looked with horror as Kennedy looks at this very well-structured speech that they just pulled off and crumples it up and throws it in his pocket. Because he was not actually a really great politician. But what he understood that night was that he could not speak to people about facts. He could only speak to people about the emotional truth that they were experiencing. He also couldn't deny the facts. He had to have the courage to present them with the fact that Martin Luther King was dead. He had to be the one to do it. But he had to tap into their emotions for the rest of it. And this is actually what he said. So I have the notes, if you'll excuse me. This is what he said. And you can actually hear him choke up as he says it in the recording. For those of you who are black and who are tempted to be filled with hatred against all white people, I would only say that I can feel in my heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, and he was killed by a white man. And he goes on, he says, my favorite poet was Aeschylus, and he's speaking about the ancient Greek poet. And Aeschylus wrote, even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us through the awful grace of God. So Kennedy was not the best politician in the race. He couldn't do electoral math. He was no Clinton, he was no Chrétien, he was no Harper. But he understood that he had to access people through their emotions and not through their facts. And that night, Indianapolis was one of the only cities in the United States where there actually was no rioting. One of my favorite philosophers is a rabbi named Abraham Heschel, who would have called that moment prophetic. Heschel didn't think prophecy, he wrote a big book about prophecy. He did not think prophecy was about forecasting the future. He didn't even think prophecy was about taking the current facts and projecting them into possible future scenarios. That's not prophecy, that's sort of trickery. Prophecy, and here he was thinking of the big guys, the guys like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Prophecy, Heschel said, is the sheer seeing of what we face in its totality. The emotion, the fact, the emotion, the fact, all of it together. And this moment, the very moment that Trump and Trudeau are signaling to us, may be the moment when we're also called to have a prophetic view, a full view of fact and emotion in all of their conflicts of the situation around us. So this week is not just the last week before the US election. It's also actually the first week that Jews start reading the Torah, the Bible, our Bible, the Old Testament, again for the year. We go through an annual cycle. And last Saturday on Shabbat, we read the first chapter of Genesis. And I think everyone here probably knows how that story opens up. What I didn't know until I sat in the synagogue last weekend was that God actually creates light twice in the story. On day 1, let there be light. But on day 4, God also says, let there be a light in the firmament to divide the day from night. Why does God create light twice? It turns out the rabbis in my tradition, the sages, say that that second light, that's the light we recognize, the light of the moon, the light of the sun. But that first light, the day 1 light, the let there be light, that light is the light of consciousness. That's the light that allows us to see the whole picture, that whole messy picture, including the facts and the emotions and the conflicting facts and the conflicting emotions. So this moment calls us to the facts, for sure. And this moment calls us beyond the facts to the sheer seeing of what we face.